Well, from Eli, let's turn to some health news right now. According to a new study, children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder might actually just be immature. Now, researchers discovered that children who are the youngest in their class are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. The condition affects up to 5% of Canadian children, and that adds up to about 2 students for every classroom. Well, Dr. Daniel Flanders is a Toronto area pediatrician. He joins us today to talk about this study. So let's talk about the size of the study. How many students were actually misdiagnosed here?
So this was a study that was done in Taiwan, and it looked at nearly 400,000 students. And essentially they did an analysis looking at whether there was a difference in the prevalence or the percentage of children who had ADHD in the youngest kids in the class versus the oldest kids in the class. And it's amazing what they showed. If you were the youngest child in the class, you had a 60% higher chance of being diagnosed with ADHD and a 75% higher chance of receiving medication for ADHD when compared to the oldest children in the class. So essentially, if you're a younger child in a classroom, there's a higher chance of you being misdiagnosed with ADHD just because you're that up to 1 year less mature than your peers.
So as opposed to hyperactivity disorder, you might just have a brain that's not yet matured and therefore leads to misdiagnosis?
Yeah, it's as if it's as if you have the brain that's ready for kindergarten, where you're going to spend most of your time playing, but you're being put into an environment where you're expected to sit for hours at a desk and focus and pay attention. And for those kids who are young, they tend to want to bounce off the walls and let their minds float. Which is not necessarily a bad thing. They just don't have they're not at the developmental stage where they're ready for that.
Well, it seems almost counterintuitive because recently, just to share, I took part in a parenting course, and a lot of prospective parents were talking about the desire to have their kids be put to school early so that they could succeed earlier. But this is exactly the child, for example, a December baby, that would be at risk of misdiagnosis.
That's right. So in Ontario, if you're born in December, it means you're going to be the youngest child in the class. And yeah, there's some research that suggests that you might actually be at a disadvantage in terms of you kind of coming out the other end, having successful job opportunities. So yeah, it's a real issue.
Now, what happens if you have a child that is medicated for a condition that they don't actually have?
Right, so I can think of 3 sort of categories of implications in a situation like that. So one approach is to say, well, you start a medication on a child that doesn't actually have a diagnosis that medication is meant to be treating. So this is a situation where you are essentially, there's no upside and there's only downside. Anytime you start a medication, you have to balance the risks and the benefits. In this case, it's all risk and no benefits. And ADHD medication side effects could include poor sleep, poor appetite leading to poor growth. It could cause anxiety symptoms. So you could imagine that when you subject a child to only side effects without any benefit, that's a real problem.
Is there an overtreatment of ADHD in this country, do you think?
So I don't think there's any question that there's overdiagnosis and overtreatment of ADHD, and this study does a wonderful job of showing that. But one thing we often miss is there's also an underdiagnosis of ADHD. There's hundreds or thousands, probably thousands of children out there in Canada who are struggling because they have unidentified, untreated ADHD, and they are not going to meet their potential. They're not going to succeed as well as they could have had they been identified and treated. So as a healthcare community, we need to do a much better job of rigorously making these diagnoses, finding the right children to treat, not treating too many, but also catching the ones who would otherwise fall through the cracks.
So teachers obviously play a big part in this and pointing out students that may have ADHD, but parents also have a role, obviously, in this. If you're a parent with a child who's born later in the year, how do you respond to this study?
Right. So it's a really interesting question because I actually have a December baby. My son was born on December 24th, and my wife and I were aware of this disadvantage, and we spent years struggling with what to do. And after a lot of discussion, we decided to hold our child back a year to essentially give him that extra year of maturity so that he goes into a classroom that he's well suited for. But I don't mean to say that that's the decision all parents should make. Every child's unique, and every child has their unique pattern of strengths and weaknesses, and one has to take all that into consideration when making the decision. But if there's a common theme, I think these kids just need time to develop without necessarily rushing into slapping a diagnosis on them and throwing medication at them.
Well, Dr. Flanders, you give us a lot to think about. Thank you for that.
Thanks so much.
And Dr. Daniel Flanders is a Toronto area pediatrician. And remember, you can head to cbcnews.ca for health news anytime. Your weekend forecast is up next right here on CBC News Network. Do stay with us.